Margaret stared at the small, wrapped box in her hands, feeling the weight of 3 weeks' work inside. Her fingers, swollen with arthritis, had moved carefully through each stitch, each tiny detail of the 2 miniature figures she'd created. The living room buzzed with expensive conversation and the clink of crystal glasses, but all she could think about was the surprise hidden deep within one of the dolls. "Time for presents," called Victoria, her daughter-in-law, clapping her hands together. The sound cut through the chatter in David's pristine Beacon Hill townhouse. Margaret watched her granddaughter Sarah move gracefully between the guests, her diamond bracelet catching the light. At 25, Sarah had inherited her mother's sharp beauty and her father's sense of entitlement. Margaret had arrived early, hoping for a quiet moment with Sarah before the party began. Instead, she'd been greeted by a doorman who didn't recognize her, forcing her to show identification to enter a home she'd helped purchase. The slight stung more than she'd expected. She remembered when David had first shown her this townhouse 15 years ago, how proud he'd been, how he'd thanked her repeatedly for the down payment that made it possible. Back then, he'd insisted she should have her own key, her own place in their lives. Now she was treated like a stranger at the door. The party guests were all young professionals, Sarah's friends from college and work, along with Michael's business associates. Margaret recognized the type: ambitious, well-dressed people who measured success in designer labels and expensive vacations. She felt out of place among them, her simple blue dress and sensible shoes marking her as someone from a different generation, a different world. "Start with the smaller gifts, darling," Victoria suggested, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy women used when orchestrating social events. Sarah's eyes immediately found Margaret's modest package among the designer bags and elaborate ribbons. The other gifts looked expensive even from their wrapping: thick, glossy paper, silk ribbons, cards from exclusive boutiques like Cartier and Hermès. Margaret stepped forward, her heart beating faster than usual. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," she said, extending the gift with both hands. The room seemed to quiet as Sarah accepted it, her perfectly manicured nails careful not to damage her cream-colored dress. Margaret had chosen that wrapping paper carefully from the stationery store where Sarah had once worked during college, back when she'd proudly shown off her employee discount and talked about saving money for graduate school. The box felt light in Sarah's hands, and Margaret could see the slight disappointment in her granddaughter's expression. In a room full of weighty packages that promised jewelry or expensive gadgets, Margaret's gift clearly didn't measure up to expectations. But inside that modest box lay something far more valuable than anything else Sarah would receive that day. Inside the box lay 2 hand-knitted figures, painstakingly crafted to resemble Sarah and her fiancé Michael on their upcoming wedding day. Margaret had spent hours perfecting the tiny details: Sarah's flowing hair recreated with careful silk threads, Michael's distinctive smile captured in miniature stitches, even the tiny bouquet in the bride's hands made from delicate cotton. She'd worked late into the night for weeks, her arthritic fingers protesting with each careful stitch, but driven by love and anticipation of Sarah's reaction. The bride doll wore a miniature version of Sarah's chosen wedding dress, which Margaret had recreated from memory after seeing photographs. The groom's tiny suit matched Michael's preferences perfectly. Margaret had even included small details that only family would notice: a tiny pearl necklace that matched the one Paul had given Margaret for their own wedding, a little bouquet that included forget-me-nots, Sarah's favorite flower from childhood. But more importantly, nestled within the bride figure where no casual observer would think to look, was Margaret's most precious possession: her grandmother's diamond ring, the one her late husband Paul had reset for their golden anniversary. The stone was nearly 2 carats, flawless and brilliant, worth more than most people's cars. It had been in the family for 4 generations, passed down from mother to daughter-in-law, a symbol of enduring love and commitment. Sarah lifted the dolls with the tips of her fingers, holding them away from her body as if they might soil her outfit. The room fell completely silent, all eyes on the birthday girl as she examined the handmade figures. Margaret watched her granddaughter's face, searching for some sign of recognition, some understanding of the love and effort that had gone into creating them. "Oh," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the silent room with perfect clarity. The single word was loaded with disappointment and barely concealed disdain. This handmade gift looks so amateur. She paused dramatically, glancing around at the watching faces, seeming to draw energy from the attention. Grandmother, you know we have a wedding registry at Nordstrom, right? The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had expected surprise, maybe even delight when Sarah discovered the hidden treasure. Instead, she was met with public humiliation. The room remained silent for a moment, as if the guests were processing what they just witnessed. The laughter started with Michael, a sharp bark that encouraged others to join in. His sound was cruel and deliberate, designed to show his superiority over what he clearly saw as an old woman's pathetic attempt at gift-giving. David's booming chuckle mixed with Victoria's delicate tittering, while Michael's groomsmen snorted their approval. The sound filled the room like a wave, washing over Margaret with devastating force. She felt her cheeks burn as if she'd been physically slapped, the heat spreading down her neck and into her chest. "They're perfect for the charity donation pile," Michael added, his voice dripping with practiced charm. His friends laughed even harder at this, one of them making a joke about grandmother crafts that sent fresh peals of laughter through the room. Another guest quipped about retirement home hobbies, and the laughter grew louder, meaner. Margaret watched in horror as the room erupted in fresh laughter, and she saw her granddaughter's face light up with the approval of her audience. Sarah was actually enjoying this moment, basking in the attention and the shared superiority over her grandmother's pathetic gift. The young woman Margaret had helped raise, had loved unconditionally, was participating in her public humiliation. Margaret opened her mouth to explain about the diamond, about the hours of careful work, about the love woven into every stitch. "I thought," she began, wanting to tell them about the family history, about the ring hidden inside, about the meaning behind every carefully chosen detail. But David interrupted with the casual dismissal she'd grown to expect. "Mother, maybe we should discuss getting you some assistance with your crafting projects," he said, placing a patronizing hand on her shoulder. His voice carried the tone he used with difficult clients, patient but condescending. "These little hobbies might be taking up too much of your time. Perhaps we should explore some social activities more appropriate for your age group." The suggestion stung almost as much as the laughter. Margaret wasn't some lonely old woman filling her time with meaningless crafts. She was an accomplished woman who had chosen to create something beautiful and meaningful for her granddaughter's wedding. But in David's words, she heard the echo of conversations that had clearly been happening behind her back, discussions about her mental state, her fitness to live independently, her need for management. "Maybe it's time to consider one of those senior centers," Victoria added helpfully, her voice sugar-sweet but laced with condescension. "They have wonderful craft programs designed specifically for elderly residents. You could make friends with people your own age." The words hit Margaret like cold water. She looked around the room, searching for even one sympathetic face among the sea of smirking guests. These were educated, supposedly sophisticated people, but they were behaving like teenagers mocking an unpopular classmate. Her grandson James, David's younger son, stood in the corner with his camera, his eyes meeting hers with quiet apology. That small kindness almost broke her resolve to remain composed. At least someone in this room still saw her as a human being worth respecting. But James was just 22, still in college, still dependent on his parents' support. He couldn't speak up for her without risking his own relationship with the family. Margaret understood that, even as she wished for just one person to defend her, to recognize the cruelty of what was happening. "I should go," Margaret said quietly, gathering her purse with hands that trembled slightly. Her voice was barely audible over the continuing chatter, and most of the guests had already moved on to the next entertainment. The laughter was already shifting to the next gift, a pair of expensive earrings from Tiffany that drew gasps of appreciation and genuine excitement from Sarah. The contrast was painful. This was the reaction Margaret had hoped for, the joy she'd wanted to create. As Margaret made her way to the door, she heard Sarah exclaiming over the earrings, her voice full of the enthusiasm that had been completely absent when opening Margaret's gift. "Oh my God! These are gorgeous. "I've been wanting these exact ones for months." The difference in tone was heartbreaking. Sarah was capable of genuine appreciation and joy, but not for anything her grandmother offered. Margaret slipped out through the side door, the sound of celebration following her into the cool evening air. Outside, she sat in her car for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. She'd been publicly humiliated by her own family, dismissed and mocked in front of strangers. The gift she'd poured her heart into had been treated like garbage, and the precious family heirloom hidden inside had been discarded without a thought. The drive home felt endless. Every traffic light seemed to take forever, giving her too much time to replay the scene over and over. She kept thinking about Sarah's face, the way her granddaughter had looked at the dolls with such obvious distaste. Where had that come from? When had Sarah become someone who could be so casually cruel to someone who loved her? At home, Margaret sat in her darkened kitchen, staring at her laptop screen. The silence of her house felt oppressive after the noise of the party. The quiet that had once brought her peace now felt like isolation, a reminder of how alone she'd become since Paul's death 3 years ago. The email from Sarah had arrived while she was at the party, its subject line reading, "Wedding venue contracts, urgent signature required." Margaret's hands trembled as she read the details, each line making her feel more invisible and disposable. Her beloved Cape Cod cottage, the home she and Paul had saved for 10 years to buy, was listed as the wedding venue. Not requested, listed, as if her permission was a foregone conclusion. The message continued with casual presumption that took Margaret's breath away. "The wedding planner starts renovations next month. We'll need to store your personal items during the updates. Can't wait to make the cottage perfect for our special day. The designer has some amazing ideas for modernizing the space. Don't worry about the cost. We know you want Sarah's day to be perfect. We've already scheduled the contractors to start work on the 15th. Margaret read the email 3 times, each reading making her angrier. Store her personal items? Modernize the space? They were talking about her home, her sanctuary, the place where she and Paul had spent the happiest years of their marriage, as if it were just a venue to be rented and redecorated. The cottage had been their dream for decades. She and Paul had scripted and saved through the early years of their marriage, putting aside every spare dollar to afford the down payment. They'd bought it when David was still in high school, planning it as their retirement retreat. Over the years, it had become the heart of their family life: holiday gatherings, summer vacations, quiet weekends away from the city. Margaret closed the laptop with a sharp click. Perfect for their special day. As if 35 years of her memories of Paul's presence in every room, of family gatherings that actually felt like family, meant nothing compared to Sarah's vision of the perfect wedding backdrop. She thought of all the summers she and Paul had spent at that cottage, the lazy mornings with coffee on the porch, the evenings watching sunsets over the water, the sense of peace that had sustained her through Paul's illness and death. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Mom, found a lovely retirement community in Brookline. Made an appointment for us to visit next week, just to explore options. The staff seems very caring, and they have wonderful activities for seniors. I think you'd really enjoy the community aspect." The timing wasn't coincidental, Margaret realized. This had all been planned: the cottage takeover, the retirement home tour, the gradual erosion of her independence. They weren't just planning Sarah's wedding. They were planning Margaret's future without consulting her about any of it. Margaret deleted the message without responding. Through her kitchen window, she could see the lights of Boston twinkling in the distance. Each light represented someone else's life, someone else's dreams and struggles. How many other elderly people were sitting in their homes tonight? She wondered, watching their children make decisions about their lives without consulting them. How many had become invisible in their own families, treated as problems to be managed rather than people to be loved and respected? The cottage keys sat on her counter where she'd left them that morning. Margaret picked them up, feeling their familiar weight. These keys represented more than just access to a building. They were symbols of her independence, her autonomy, her right to make her own choices about her own property. She thought about all the times she'd driven to the cottage seeking solace, finding peace in the rhythm of the waves, and the familiar comfort of spaces she and Paul had created together. Suddenly, she felt desperate to see the place before Sarah's renovations began. She needed to stand in her sanctuary one more time, to remember what it felt like to be valued and at peace. The drive to Cape Cod felt urgent now, necessary in a way she couldn't fully explain. The familiar route calmed her slightly. She'd driven this road countless times over the decades, in every season and weather condition. Usually, the anticipation of arriving at the cottage filled her with joy. Tonight, it felt like she was racing to say goodbye to something precious that was about to be destroyed. When she arrived, there was already a silver Mercedes in the driveway, Victoria's car. Margaret's stomach dropped. Through the front windows, she could see figures moving around her living room, gesturing and pointing as if they owned the place. The sight of strangers in her private space felt like a violation, an invasion of the one place that had remained purely hers since Paul's death. She pushed open the door she'd left unlocked for 40 years, a habit from simpler times when trust was still possible. The cottage had always been a place of open doors and warm welcomes, but now that openness felt naive, dangerous. "The wall between the kitchen and dining room has to go," a woman was saying as Margaret stepped inside. "Mrs. Patterson won't mind. She's hardly here anymore. We need to create a better flow for the reception, more space for the catering setup." Margaret found Sarah, Victoria, and a sleek woman with an iPad standing in her kitchen. The same kitchen where she'd taught Sarah to make Paul's favorite fish stew when Sarah was 9 years old. That had been such a sweet memory. Sarah standing on a step stool, carefully stirring the pot while Margaret guided her small hands. Where had that loving child gone? The woman with the iPad was clearly a designer, her black clothing and severe haircut marking her as someone from the city, someone who saw the cottage as a project rather than a home. She was taking measurements and photographs, treating Margaret's beloved spaces like a problem to be solved. "Actually, I do mind," Margaret said quietly. The three women spun around, Victoria recovering first with the practiced grace she'd perfected over years of social situations. Her surprise was genuine. They clearly hadn't expected Margaret to show up unannounced at her own property. "Margaret, what a surprise. We were just discussing some small updates for the wedding. Nothing major, just some improvements to make the space more camera-ready." Victoria's voice carried that tone of forced cheerfulness she used when caught doing something she knew was wrong. "Removing a load-bearing wall isn't a small update," Margaret replied, setting her purse on the counter that had been her morning coffee spot for decades. She'd stood at this exact spot thousands of times, watching the sunrise over the water, feeling grateful for the life she and Paul had built together. Now strangers were discussing tearing it apart. Sarah stepped forward, her earlier cruelty replaced by manufactured sweetness that somehow felt worse than honest dismissal. "Grandma, we talked about this at Christmas, remember? You said we could use the cottage and make it beautiful for the ceremony. You seemed so excited about hosting our wedding." Margaret searched her memory of that Christmas conversation. She remembered Sarah mentioning the cottage as a possible venue, and Margaret had said it was a lovely idea. But there had been no discussion of renovations, no mention of contractors or designers. Somehow, her polite interest had been transformed into blanket permission for a complete overhaul. "I said you could use it. I never agreed to renovation." Margaret's voice was steady, but inside she felt like she was fighting for her life, for the last piece of her identity that remained intact. The wedding planner, apparently unaware of the family tension or simply choosing to ignore it, flipped through her tablet with professional enthusiasm. "The property has good bones, but the aesthetic is quite dated. We're envisioning white everything: walls, furniture, fixtures. Very clean, very minimal, very Instagram-worthy. The current decor is very rustic grandmother, if you know what I mean." She laughed at her own observation, as if Margaret's taste was some kind of charming anachronism. Margaret felt each word like a slap. Rustic grandmother. The cottage wasn't decorated according to the latest trends. It was filled with pieces she and Paul had chosen together, furniture that held memories, artwork that told the story of their life together. Every item had meaning, history, love attached to it. Margaret walked to the living room window, looking out at the Atlantic Ocean that she and Paul had saved so hard to afford. The view had been their dream, their reward for decades of careful saving and hard work. When they'd first seen this cottage 40 years ago, they'd stood at this window and imagined all the mornings they'd spend watching the sunrise, all the evenings they'd sit together watching the waves. On the mantel, she noticed her favorite photograph was missing, the one of her and Paul on their 40th anniversary, taken right here on this porch by James when he was just 15. Paul had his arm around her shoulders, both of them tan and relaxed, truly happy. In its place sat a mood board labeled Coastal Chic, with images of stark white rooms that bore no resemblance to the warm, lived-in home she'd created. "Where's my picture?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the ocean outside. Victoria glanced around vaguely, as if the question was unimportant. "Oh, we've carefully packed some of the more personal items for safekeeping during the renovations. Don't worry, everything is perfectly safe. We just need to clear the space for the designers to work their magic." The casual dismissal of her belongings as personal items that needed to be cleared away stung deeply. These weren't random decorations. They were her memories, her life, her connection to Paul. But to Victoria, they were just clutter that interfered with the perfect wedding aesthetic. "The master bedroom would make an excellent bridal suite," the designer continued, apparently oblivious to Margaret's distress. "We could add a beautiful vanity area, install better lighting for photographs. The current furniture is quite heavy and old-fashioned. We'd want to replace all of that with something more elegant." Margaret's heart clenched. The master bedroom furniture was the first set she and Paul had bought as newlyweds. They'd saved for months to afford the mahogany dresser and headboard, then spent a wonderful Saturday afternoon setting it up in their first apartment. Later, when they bought the cottage, moving those pieces had been one of the first things they'd done, a way of making the new space truly theirs. "And this kitchen," the designer gestured dismissively, "really needs a complete overhaul. Those cabinets are so dated, and the appliances are ancient. We're thinking white marble countertops, stainless steel appliances, maybe some open shelving for a more modern farmhouse feel." The kitchen that Margaret had lovingly designed and slowly improved over the years was being dismissed as outdated. She thought of all the meals she'd prepared here, all the family gatherings that had centered around this kitchen table. Sarah had learned to cook here, had spent countless summer afternoons helping Margaret prepare dinner while chattering about school and friends and dreams. After they left, Margaret searched the house systematically, her anxiety growing with each room. The cottage felt violated, contaminated by their casual dismissal of everything she valued. In the garage, she found 3 boxes labeled Margaret's items, in Victoria's neat handwriting. The clinical precision of the labeling somehow made it worse, her life reduced to categories, filed away like unwanted paperwork. Inside the first box was her anniversary photograph, carelessly placed beneath Sarah's birthday party decorations. The frame was cracked where something heavy had been placed on top of it. Seeing Paul's face damaged made her feel sick. It was as if they'd injured him all over again. In the second box were Paul's books, their margins filled with his careful notes and observations. A lifetime of learning reduced to clutter. Paul had been an avid reader, especially of history and philosophy. He'd filled these books with his thoughts, creating a kind of intellectual diary that Margaret had treasured. Now they were packed away like things for a yard sale. And in the third box, tossed in without consideration, were the knitted dolls from Sarah's party, discarded like trash. The sight of them there, crumpled and dismissed, broke something inside Margaret. These dolls represented weeks of work, careful attention to detail, love poured into every stitch, and they'd been thrown away like garbage. Margaret lifted the bride figure carefully, her hands shaking with anger and grief. She felt for the small opening she'd created in the torso, her heart pounding as her fingers found the hidden compartment. The diamond was still there, safely hidden where no one had thought to look. Just like she had been invisible to her family, the true value of her gift had been completely overlooked. The irony was almost unbearable. They had dismissed something that could have paid for Sarah's entire wedding and then some. The ring was worth at least $50,000, possibly more given its age and provenance. But they'd been so focused on the surface, so quick to judge and dismiss, that they'd thrown away a fortune along with her feelings. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. David's name appeared on the screen, and she almost didn't answer. But some ingrained sense of duty, decades of putting family obligations first, made her pick up. "Mom, about that retirement community tour, I really think we should schedule it soon. The waiting list is quite long, and with the cottage being used for family events, it makes sense to start planning your transition." His voice had that carefully controlled quality that meant he'd rehearsed this conversation, probably with Victoria coaching him on the right tone to use. My transition? The word felt foreign in her mouth, loaded with implications she wasn't ready to accept. "Victoria and I were thinking that since the cottage will be primarily for family gatherings, it might be wise to transfer it to a family trust. Just for tax purposes, of course. It would ensure the property stays in the family and reduce your burden of maintenance and upkeep." David's lawyer training was evident in how smoothly he delivered this pitch, as if he were presenting a business proposal rather than asking his mother to give up her home. The suggestion hit Margaret like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to use her cottage for the wedding. They were planning to take it away from her permanently. The family trust would put the property under David's control, leaving her with no say in how it was used or maintained. She would become a guest in her own home, dependent on their permission to visit the place she loved most. Margaret hung up without responding, her hands shaking with anger. On her kitchen table, she found a brochure that hadn't been there that morning. Sunset Manor, where independence meets care. Someone had circled a floor plan in red ink, with a note in Victoria's handwriting. Perfect for mom, 1 bedroom, kitchenette, all meals included. Much easier than maintaining a whole house. The brochure made her feel sick. The rooms were tiny, sterile, designed for people who had given up on life. The activities listed bingo, crafts, movie nights, sounded like distractions for children rather than engagement for adults. This was what they saw as her future. A small room in an institutional building, surrounded by other discarded elderly people, filling her days with meaningless activities until she died. They were dividing up her life into manageable pieces, Margaret realized. The cottage would go to the family trust, her belongings would be stored or donated, and she would be tucked away in assisted living where she couldn't interfere with their plans. And until today, she had been letting them, had been so focused on maintaining family harmony that she'd allowed herself to become a supporting character in her own life. That night, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling, Paul's absence feeling more acute than it had in months. What would he think of what their family had become? What would he say about his son's presumption, his granddaughter's cruelty, his daughter-in-law's manipulation? Paul had always been the strong one, the one who set boundaries and stuck to them. He would never have allowed this disrespect to continue. But more importantly, what would he say about Margaret's response? For too long, she had been the accommodating mother, the generous grandmother, the convenient source of financial and emotional support. She had confused love with enablement, kindness with weakness. She had taught her family to take her for granted by never saying no, never setting limits, never demanding the respect she deserved. The diamond in the knitted doll had been meant as a symbol of lasting love, a family treasure passed down through generations. Instead, it had become a metaphor for everything the family refused to see in her value, hidden beneath a surface they deemed unworthy of their attention. How many other gifts had she given over the years that were dismissed or forgotten? How many times had her efforts been met with indifference or disdain? Margaret rose from bed and walked to her window, looking out at the ocean waves crashing against the rocks below. The sound had always comforted her, but tonight it seemed to echo with a different message. Not the gentle rhythm of acceptance, but the steady, relentless force of nature reclaiming what belonged to it. The tide always turned, she realized. Always. Tomorrow, she decided, would mark the beginning of a different kind of tide. Tomorrow, she would stop being a victim of other people's selfishness and start being the author of her own story. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. After decades of putting everyone else first, it was time to put herself at the center of her own life. Margaret woke the next morning with unusual clarity. The hurt from Sarah's party had crystallized overnight into something sharper and more useful: determination. She made coffee in her quiet kitchen, watching the sunrise paint the ocean in shades of gold and pink. For the first time in months, she felt truly awake, truly present in her own life. The decision to fight back had lifted a weight she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Mom, confirmed appointment at Sunset Manor for Thursday at 2 p.m. Victoria and I will pick you up at 1:30. Looking forward to exploring this next chapter together." The director seems wonderful, very understanding of the challenges families face when transitioning elderly parents to care facilities. The language of the text made Margaret's stomach turn. Transitioning elderly parents to care facilities, as if she were a package to be delivered rather than a person making a choice. She deleted the message and called her doctor instead. "Dr. Chun, this is Margaret Patterson. I'd like to schedule an appointment as soon as possible. I've been experiencing some concerning symptoms." It wasn't entirely untrue. The stress of the past few months had taken a physical toll she could no longer ignore. Her sleep was disrupted, her appetite poor, and she'd been experiencing heart palpitations that left her breathless and frightened. Within an hour, she was sitting in Dr. Chen's office, watching him review her chart with growing concern. Dr. Chun had been her physician for 15 years, ever since her previous doctor retired. He'd guided her through Paul's illness and death with compassion and skill, and she trusted his judgment completely. "Your blood pressure is significantly elevated from your last visit 6 months ago," he said, removing his stethoscope with a frown. His usually calm demeanor showed signs of real worry. "Any major stressors in your life recently?" Margaret almost laughed at the understatement. "Some family challenges," she said, the words barely capturing the magnitude of what she was experiencing. "Mrs. Patterson, at your age, stress isn't just uncomfortable. It can be dangerous. I've seen patients hospitalized after family conflicts triggered serious cardiac events." He leaned forward, his expression serious and caring. "Your body is telling us that you're under tremendous strain. Whatever's happening with your family, your health has to come first. You can't pour from an empty cup." V6. Dr. Chun ordered blood work and an EKG, both of which confirmed what Margaret already knew. Her body was breaking down under the pressure of family stress. The numbers were stark, undeniable evidence that the situation at home was literally threatening her health. After leaving the doctor's office, Margaret drove straight to downtown Boston and parked outside a gleaming office building. Marcus Webb, the estate attorney Paul had introduced her to years ago, agreed to see her immediately when she called from the lobby. His concern was evident in his voice when she briefly explained the situation. "Margaret," Marcus said, rising from behind his mahogany desk to greet her with genuine warmth. Marcus was in his 70s himself, a distinguished man who had built his practice on protecting families and their assets. "I was sorry to hear about the issues you mentioned on the phone. Paul would be very concerned about what you've described. He always spoke so highly of your family." The mention of Paul's name brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Paul had trusted Marcus completely, had often said that Marcus was one of the few truly honest lawyers he'd ever met. If Paul trusted him, Margaret knew she could too. Margaret spread the documents she'd brought across his conference table: bank statements, property deeds, insurance policies, and the retirement community brochures she'd found scattered around her home like breadcrumbs leading to her forced surrender. "Marcus, I need to understand my options. My son seems to believe he has more say in my finances than he actually does." Marcus studied the papers with the methodical attention that had made him one of Boston's most respected estate attorneys. He occasionally asked clarifying questions, his expression growing more serious with each answer. Margaret watched him work, feeling grateful for his careful attention to detail. "These are all in your name alone. Paul was smart to structure things that way," he said finally, looking up at her with approval. "Has David asked for power of attorney?" "3 times since Christmas. I've been avoiding the conversation, making excuses, changing the subject." Margaret felt ashamed admitting how she'd been dodging her own son, but Marcus's expression remained non-judgmental. "Good. Don't sign anything without careful consideration and independent legal advice. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Margaret, I have to ask, are you being pressured to make financial decisions you're not comfortable with? Margaret told him everything. The wedding venue assumption, the renovation plans made without consultation, the retirement home visits scheduled without her input, the attempted access to her bank accounts that her grandson James had discovered. She described the birthday party humiliation, the casual dismissal of her feelings, the way her family had started treating her like an inconvenience rather than a person. Marcus took detailed notes, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. This isn't just family drama, he said finally, setting down his pen with deliberate care. This is a systematic attempt to gain control of your assets. In my 40 years of practice, I've seen this pattern many times. Have you looked into David's financial situation recently? The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. What do you mean? I mean, is there a reason why your son might suddenly be so interested in your financial affairs? In my experience, when adult children start pushing for control over their parents' assets, there's usually an underlying financial motivation. It's rarely about concern for the parents' welfare. That afternoon, Margaret met with Patricia Reynolds, a private investigator Marcus had recommended. Patricia was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who specialized in financial investigations. Her office was small and cluttered, filled with file cabinets and computer monitors, the workspace of someone who dealt in facts rather than appearances. I'll need a few days to dig into this properly, Patricia had said when Margaret first contacted her. Financial investigations take time, especially when people are trying to hide their problems. Within 2 days, Patricia called with her findings, requesting to meet in person rather than discuss the details over the phone. They met at a quiet restaurant downtown, away from any chance of running into family members. Your son is in serious financial trouble, Patricia reported, spreading documents across the table with the efficiency of someone who delivered this type of news many times before. His law practice took a major hit when the Millfield development deal collapsed. He's facing potential lawsuits from multiple investors, and he's already taken a second mortgage on his home. Margaret felt her stomach sink as she studied the papers. The numbers were staggering. David owed over $2 million to various creditors, with monthly payments that far exceeded his current income. His law practice, once thriving, had lost most of its major clients after the development failure. How bad is it? Margaret asked, though she could already see the answer in the stark financial statements. Bad enough that your assets would solve most of his problems. The cottage alone is worth enough to cover his immediate debts, and your investment accounts could fund his legal defense and help him restart his practice. Patricia's voice was gentle but direct. Mrs. Patterson, I've seen this before. Desperate people make desperate choices, even when it comes to family. Especially when they convince themselves they're acting in everyone's best interest. The revelation explained everything. The sudden interest in her living arrangements, the pressure to sign over power of attorney, the casual assumption that her cottage would be available for Sarah's wedding. David wasn't just being presumptuous about her future. He was drowning financially and saw her as his only life preserver. That evening, Margaret sat in her study, Paul's photograph watching over her as she processed everything she'd learned. The man in the photo seemed to be looking at her with understanding, even approval. Paul had always been suspicious of get-rich-quick schemes, had warned David repeatedly about the risks of speculative investments. If only David had listened. Her phone rang, interrupting her dark thoughts. It was James, David's younger son, calling from his college apartment. His voice carried genuine concern that was increasingly rare in her family. Grandma, are you okay? You seemed upset when you left Sarah's party. The genuine concern in his voice almost brought her to tears. I'm fine, dear. Just tired. I wanted you to know, I heard Dad on the phone with someone about your bank accounts. He was asking about joint account options and something about financial oversight for elderly parents. James's voice was troubled, uncertain. Grandma, I don't think he's trying to hurt you. But Margaret's hands tightened on the phone. The conversation James was describing confirmed her worst fears. When was this? Yesterday. And Grandma, I found some papers he left in the printer. Bills, legal notices. I think he's in real financial trouble. There were letters from lawyers, threatening to sue him for something called investor fraud. After hanging up, Margaret made 3 crucial phone calls. The first was to her bank, requesting additional security measures on all her accounts. The casual assumption that Margaret would pay without question was breathtaking in its arrogance. Margaret deleted the message and called Marcus instead. "The sale documents are ready," he told her. "Are you certain about this course of action? Once we begin, there's no going back. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Your family will be very upset. Marcus, they're already treating me like I'm incompetent and dispensable. At least this way, I'm making my own choices instead of having choices made for me." That evening, Margaret received an unexpected call from Dr. Chen's office. "Mrs. Patterson, your blood work came back. We'd like you to come in tomorrow to discuss the results." At the appointment, Dr. Chen's expression was serious as he reviewed her test results. "Your stress indicators are through the roof. Your cortisol levels, blood pressure, even your blood sugar, everything suggests you're under significant chronic stress. If this continues, you're at risk for serious health complications." "What kind of complications?" "Heart attack, stroke, immune system breakdown." "Margaret, whatever's happening in your personal life, it's literally threatening your health. You need to make some changes, or this stress could kill you." His words were stark but necessary. The medical confirmation of what she already knew, that her family's behavior was literally harmful to her health, removed the last vestiges of doubt about her decision. She wasn't being dramatic or vindictive. She was fighting for her life. Driving home from the doctor's office, Margaret felt a strange sense of liberation. For months, she'd been questioning herself, wondering if she was overreacting to her family's behavior. Now she had objective medical proof that their treatment of her was dangerous to her well-being. She called Jennifer Walsh. "The cottage sale, I want to accelerate the timeline. How quickly can we close? The buyers are motivated. With the right incentives, we could close in 2 weeks. Do it." That night, Margaret sat in her study with Paul's photograph, feeling his presence more strongly than she had in months. She could almost hear his voice, encouraging her to stand up for herself the way he always had. "I know this isn't what we planned," she said to his image, "but I think you'd understand. I can't let them destroy what we built together, and I can't let them destroy me in the process." She opened her laptop and began typing an email to Jennifer Walsh, officially authorizing the sale of the cottage. As she hit send, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of taking control of her own destiny. The cottage sale would proceed with ruthless efficiency. Within days, appraisers and inspectors would examine the property. Legal documents would be drafted and signed. Money would change hands, and her family's carefully laid plans would crumble into chaos. Tomorrow would bring the storm, but tonight, she was finally steering her own ship. The call from David came at 7 in the morning, 3 days after Margaret had signed the final sale documents. She let it ring 4 times before answering, savoring her last moments of peace before the hurricane hit. When she finally picked up, she could hear the barely controlled panic in her son's voice. "Mother, what the hell have you done?" His voice was raw with panic and fury, all pretense of civility abandoned. In the background, she could hear Victoria's voice, high-pitched and agitated, though she couldn't make out the words. "Good morning, David. I've sold my cottage." Margaret's voice was calm, steady. She'd been preparing for this moment for days, and now that it was here, she felt surprisingly peaceful. "You can't just sell the cottage. Sarah's wedding is in 3 weeks. We've sent invitations to 200 people, hired vendors, made deposits." David's voice cracked with the strain of trying to process what she told him. "Then I suggest you start making alternative arrangements." Margaret poured herself a second cup of coffee, surprised by how calm she felt in the eye of the storm. The morning light streaming through her kitchen windows seemed brighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from the world. "This is insane. You're having some kind of breakdown." Victoria was right. We should have moved forward with the assisted living arrangements months ago. David's voice had taken on the desperate edge of someone whose carefully constructed plans were collapsing around him. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, David. The line went silent for a moment, and Margaret could picture her son struggling to process this new reality. When David spoke again, his voice had shifted to the measured tone he used in court, the voice of a lawyer trying to control a hostile witness. Mother, I'm coming over. We need to discuss this rationally. I'm bringing Victoria and Sarah. This affects all of us, and we need to find a solution that works for everyone. I'll be here. Margaret spent the hour before David's arrival preparing for what she knew would be the most difficult confrontation of her life. She pulled out her recent medical records, her bank statements, and the documentation of her family's behavior that she'd been keeping since the birthday party. If David wanted to question her competency, she'd be ready with evidence of her own. She also retrieved the knitted dolls from where she'd stored them after finding them in the cottage garage. The bride doll sat on her coffee table, the hidden diamond still concealed within its fabric body, a secret that would soon be revealed to devastating effect. He arrived with Victoria and Sarah in tow, their faces displaying varying degrees of shock and anger. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed, her usual composure completely shattered. Her designer clothes looked rumpled, as if she'd thrown them on in haste. Victoria looked grim and determined, her jaw set in a way that suggested she was prepared for battle. David appeared to be barely controlling his rage, his face flushed and his hands clenched into fists. Grandma, please tell me this is some kind of mistake, Sarah said before anyone else could speak, her voice breaking with emotion. Logan's parents are flying in from California tomorrow. The photographer, the caterer, the florist, everything's booked for the cottage. The invitations have been sent to 200 people. How am I supposed to explain this? Margaret looked at her granddaughter and felt a pang of sympathy for the genuine distress in her voice. But she pushed it down, remembering the cruelty at the birthday party, the casual dismissal of her feelings and her gift. Then you should have asked my permission before booking anything. David stepped forward, his lawyer mask firmly in place despite the early hour and obvious stress. Mother, let's sit down and discuss this calmly. I think there's been a misunderstanding about everyone's intentions here. They gathered in Margaret's living room, the same space where she'd spent countless evenings with Paul, planning their dreams for the cottage they'd worked so hard to buy. Now it felt like a courtroom, with her family as hostile witnesses arrayed against her. The morning light that had seemed so bright in the kitchen felt harsh here, illuminating the tension on everyone's faces. The cottage was always meant to be a family property, David began, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he used with juries. When you're gone, it would naturally pass to Sarah and James anyway. The manager, alarmed by Margaret's report of attempted unauthorized access, immediately implemented new protocols requiring in-person verification for any major transactions. The second call was to Marcus, asking him to draft new estate documents that would protect her interests. I want everything locked down, she told him. New will, new power of attorney documents that explicitly prevent family members from making decisions without my consent, whatever it takes to protect myself. The third call was to a real estate agent whose name Marcus had provided. Jennifer Walsh speaking. Ms. Walsh, this is Margaret Patterson. I understand you specialize in discrete property sales. Yes, I do. What kind of property are we discussing? Waterfront cottage on Cape Cod. I need it sold quickly and privately. There was a pause. Jennifer was clearly intrigued by the urgency in Margaret's voice. May I ask why the urgency? Margaret looked out her window at the lights of Boston, each one representing someone else's life, someone else's dreams and struggles. Let's just say I need to make some changes before others make them for me. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Victoria arrived at Margaret's door with coffee and pastries from Margaret's favorite bakery, a gesture that immediately put Margaret on guard. Victoria never did anything without an agenda, and kindness from her usually came with strings attached. I wanted to apologize for yesterday, Victoria said, settling into Margaret's living room with practiced grace. She looked perfectly put together as always, not a hair out of place despite the early hour. I think we got carried away with the wedding planning. Sarah's been under so much stress with the preparations, and we just want everything to be perfect for her special day. Margaret accepted the coffee but remained standing, unwilling to settle into the comfortable conversation Victoria was trying to orchestrate. Stress doesn't excuse cruelty, Victoria. Of course not. That's why I'm here. Victoria smiled her most charming smile, the one she used when she wanted something. David and I were thinking, instead of the retirement community tour, what if we looked at some lovely assisted living options right here in your neighborhood? You could keep your independence but have support when you need it. The best of both worlds. Margaret recognized the strategy, retreat slightly from the most aggressive position while still pushing toward the same goal. Victoria was skilled at this kind of manipulation, making unreasonable requests seem like generous compromises. And who would manage this arrangement? Well, David has experience with legal matters, and I've always been good with organization. We could help coordinate your care, handle the financial aspects. Victoria's voice trailed off as she seemed to realize how her words sounded. You want to manage my care and my finances? Victoria's composure slipped slightly, a crack appearing in her perfect facade. Margaret, we're family. We want what's best for you. You have to understand, David is so worried about you living alone, especially after Paul's death. We just want to make sure you're safe and cared for. The concern sounded rehearsed, hollow. Margaret could see through it now, could recognize the manipulation techniques that had been working on her for months. What's best for me? Or what's most convenient for David's financial situation? The coffee cup in Victoria's hand rattled against its saucer. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. Margaret sat down across from her daughter-in-law, studying the woman who had married into her family 28 years ago. Victoria had always been charming, social, concerned with appearances above all else. Margaret had tried for years to build a real relationship with her, but Victoria had always kept her at arm's length. I know about the development deal, Victoria. I know about the second mortgage and the investor lawsuits. I know David's been trying to access my bank accounts. Victoria's carefully constructed facade crumbled like a house of cards. Her face went pale, and her hands began to shake. Margaret, please. David's made some mistakes, but he's a good man. He's just scared. He never meant for things to get this bad. Scared enough to pressure his elderly mother into giving up her home and her financial independence? It's not like that. We genuinely think you'd be happier with less responsibility, less stress. And if the cottage could help David get back on his feet. Victoria leaned forward, her voice becoming pleading, desperate. You have so much, Margaret, more than you could ever use. Is it wrong to want to help family? The question hung in the air between them. On the surface, it seemed reasonable. Family should help family, after all. But Margaret could see the manipulation behind it, the way Victoria was trying to make her feel guilty for not volunteering to sacrifice her independence for David's mistakes. Margaret stood up, feeling a clarity she hadn't experienced in months. It's wrong to lie about your motives. It's wrong to manipulate someone who trusted you. And it's definitely wrong to make plans for someone else's life without consulting them. After Victoria left, Margaret called Jennifer Walsh. I've made my decision about the cottage. I want to proceed with the sale immediately. I actually have some interest already. A couple from New York, looking for exactly what you're offering. They're prepared to move quickly if the price is right. How quickly? With the right motivation, we could close in 3 weeks. Margaret looked at her calendar. Sarah's wedding was scheduled for 6 weeks away. The timing would create maximum chaos, maximum consequence for their presumptuous planning. Perfect. That afternoon, Margaret drove to the cottage one more time before listing it. She needed to say goodbye properly, to honor the memories she and Paul had created there before letting it go. The drive felt different this time. Not desperate like her previous visit, but purposeful. She walked through each room slowly, remembering. The kitchen where she taught Sarah to cook, back when her granddaughter had been sweet and eager to learn. The living room where she and Paul had spent countless evenings reading together, the fire crackling while ocean waves provided a peaceful soundtrack. the bedroom where they'd made love and planned dreams and comforted each other through life's difficulties. In the master bedroom, she found more evidence of Sarah's plans: fabric swatches for new curtains, paint samples taped to the walls, a floor plan showing her personal spaces redesigned as guest suites. The casual invasion of her private space felt like another violation. They hadn't just planned to use her cottage. They'd planned to erase her from it completely. On the nightstand where she usually kept Paul's reading glasses, someone had left a stack of wedding magazines. Margaret flipped through them, finding pages marked with Sarah's notes about cottage chic and rustic elegance. Her home had been reduced to a Pinterest board, a backdrop for someone else's perfect moment. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Grandma, the florist needs final approval on the arrangements. I've chosen white roses and hydrangeas, $15,000 total. Can you transfer the deposit by Friday? The florist is getting impatient, and I promised her payment by end of week. $15,000 for flowers. We were simply planning ahead, trying to create beautiful memories while you're still with us to enjoy them." Margaret almost laughed at the euphemism. "Planning my death, you mean?" Victoria leaned forward, her voice carefully modulated to sound reasonable and caring. "Margaret, that's not fair. We were trying to help you transition to a simpler lifestyle while creating beautiful memories for the family. The cottage requires so much maintenance, so much worry. We thought this would relieve you of that burden while giving Sarah the wedding of her dreams. Without consulting me about any of it." "We tried to include you," Sarah interjected, her voice rising with frustration and hurt. "But you've been so resistant to change, so stubborn about everything. We thought if we just handled the details, presented you with a beautiful plan, you'd see how wonderful it could be. We thought you'd be happy to see the cottage being used for something so special." Margaret studied her granddaughter's face, seeing genuine confusion there alongside the anger. Sarah truly didn't understand what she'd done wrong, couldn't see how her behavior had been hurtful and presumptuous. "You thought if you just bulldozed over my wishes, I'd eventually give in." Margaret's voice remained steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "You thought wrong." David pulled out his phone and made a show of scrolling through his contacts. "I'm calling Dr. Chun. I think you need a psychiatric evaluation before we proceed with any major financial decisions. This kind of erratic behavior isn't normal for you, Mom. We're concerned about your mental state." The threat was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards. But Margaret was ready for this move. "I saw Dr. Chun yesterday. He's already documented that my judgment is sound and that my health problems are directly related to family stress." Margaret handed David a folder containing all her medical documentation. "Everything's there: medical records, mental competency evaluation, financial statements. I'm old, David, not stupid." David's composure finally cracked as he read through the documents. The medical evidence was clear and damning. Margaret was suffering physically from the stress her family was causing, but her mental faculties were completely intact. "This isn't about your competency. It's about destroying your own family. Sarah's reputation is ruined. Logan's family thinks we're complete disasters. And I—" He stopped abruptly, realizing he was about to reveal too much. "And you're facing bankruptcy without access to my assets," Margaret finished quietly. The admission hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Victoria's face went white, while Sarah looked back and forth between her father and grandmother with growing understanding and horror. "You knew about Dad's financial problems?" Sarah asked Margaret, her voice barely a whisper. "I know about the failed development deal, the investor lawsuits, the second mortgage. I know about the attempts to access my bank accounts and the retirement home brochures left around my house like breadcrumbs leading to my inevitable surrender." Margaret looked at each of them in turn. "I know this was never about my welfare or your wedding, Sarah. This was about money." David slumped in his chair, the fight going out of him as his secret was finally exposed. "I was trying to protect everyone. If I could just get past this rough patch, everything would go back to normal. I never meant for it to get this bad. By sacrificing my autonomy and my home, I thought you'd understand. I thought family meant helping each other, making sacrifices for the people you love." His voice was plaintive now, the voice of a child trying to justify bad behavior. Helping each other requires honesty, David. It requires asking, not taking. It requires respecting the other person's right to say no. Sarah suddenly stood up, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. So because Dad made some business mistakes, you decided to punish me? To destroy my wedding and humiliate me in front of everyone I know? Margaret looked at her granddaughter, this beautiful, privileged young woman who had never learned the difference between wanting something and deserving it. Sarah, when you opened my gift at your party, how did it make you feel to mock it in front of everyone? This isn't about your silly dolls. Answer the question. Sarah's anger faltered slightly as she was forced to confront her own behavior. I don't know. It just looked so homemade, cheap. I was embarrassed because everyone else had given me expensive things, and yours looked like something from a craft fair. And how do you think I felt? For the first time, Sarah seemed to consider the question, really think about the impact of her words and actions. I didn't really think about that. No, you didn't. None of you did. You saw an elderly woman's handmade gift and decided it was worthless without even examining it properly. Margaret walked to the coffee table and picked up the bride doll she'd placed there earlier. Sarah's eyes widened in recognition, and perhaps the first stirring of guilt. You kept them? I found them in the garage at the cottage, thrown away like garbage. Margaret's voice was steady, but the pain was evident. But before we continue, there's something you should know about this gift you dismissed so casually. Margaret's fingers found the small opening she'd created in the doll's torso. With careful movements, she extracted something that made everyone in the room gasp. A stunning diamond ring that caught the morning light and threw rainbows across the ceiling. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Is that? My grandmother's diamond ring. The one you've been hinting about for months. The one you threw away without a second thought. Margaret held the ring up so it caught the light. Nearly 2 carats, flawless, worth approximately $60,000. It's been in our family for 4 generations. The room fell completely silent. Sarah sank back into her chair, her hand covering her mouth as the full impact of her mistake hit her. Victoria looked stunned, while David's face cycled through disbelief, horror, and what might have been admiration for his mother's strategic thinking. You hid it in the doll? Victoria whispered. I wanted it to be a surprise for her wedding day, a family treasure passed down through generations. Margaret's voice was steady, but there was deep sadness beneath the calm. Instead, it ended up in your garbage bin, just like your opinion of me. David looked stricken. Mother, we had no idea. Exactly. You had no idea because you never bothered to look deeper. You saw what you expected to see. A confused old woman making crafts to fill her time. Margaret returned to her chair, feeling suddenly exhausted. Just like you've seen what you expected to see about me. A burden to be managed rather than a person to be respected. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind the weight of 78 years and a fractured family. But alongside the exhaustion was something new. A sense of her own power, her own worth that had been missing for too long. The cottage closes next week, she said quietly. The new owners take possession immediately. I suggest you start calling your vendors. Sarah began to cry. Not the delicate tears she used for effect, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone whose world had just collapsed. Logan's going to leave me. His parents already think I'm too dramatic, too high maintenance. When they hear about this, then maybe this is an opportunity to find out if he really loves you, Margaret said. Or if he's just as shallow as you've been. The words were harsh, but Margaret felt no satisfaction in saying them. She was tired of being angry, tired of fighting, tired of being disappointed by people she'd loved unconditionally for decades. Victoria stood up abruptly. I think we should go. This conversation isn't helping anyone. As they prepared to leave, David turned back to Margaret. His face showed a mixture of defeat and something that might have been respect. What happens now? Do we just stop being a family? Margaret looked at her son. This man who looked so much like Paul but had inherited none of his integrity. That depends on whether you can learn to see me as a person instead of a resource. After they left, Margaret sat alone in her living room, surrounded by the silence that had once felt peaceful but now felt different. Not empty, but cleared. Her phone rang almost immediately. James, calling from his college apartment. "Grandma, I just got off the phone with Sarah. She's hysterical. Is it true about the cottage?" "Yes, it's true." "Good for you." The simple statement caught Margaret off guard. "What?" "I said good for you. They've been treating you terribly, and someone needed to stand up to them. I'm proud of you." James's voice was steady, mature beyond his 22 years. "I know it couldn't have been easy, but you did the right thing." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. The first genuine emotion she'd allowed herself since the confrontation began. "Thank you, James. That means more than you know. Are you okay? Do you need anything?" "I'm okay. Better than okay, actually." After hanging up with James, Margaret called Marcus Webb. "It's done. They know about the sale." "How did they take it?" "About as well as expected. David's threatening legal action, but he knows he doesn't have grounds." "And how are you feeling?" Margaret considered the question. She felt empty, but not in a bad way, like a house that had been cleared of clutter, ready for new possibilities. "Free," she said finally. "For the first time in years, I feel free." That evening, Margaret began the process of sorting through her possessions, deciding what to keep for her next chapter and what to let go of from her past. She found photo albums filled with family memories that now felt bittersweet, holiday cards from grandchildren who had grown into strangers, and mementos from a marriage that had been the happiest part of her life. The cottage sale had been just the beginning. Over the following weeks, she would make other changes, selling the Boston house that had become too large and moving to a modern apartment downtown, establishing new estate planning documents that protected her interests, and most importantly, setting clear boundaries about how she would and wouldn't be treated. The silence that followed Margaret's decision stretched on for weeks. No angry phone calls, no guilt-inducing visits, no manipulative text messages. Her family had simply disappeared from her life, as if the cottage sale had severed every connection between them. Margaret found the quiet both liberating and unexpectedly lonely, but she refused to regret her choice. She spent her days reorganizing her life, finally making changes she'd postponed for years, while accommodating everyone else's preferences. Paul's heavy oak furniture went to charity, replaced by lighter pieces that didn't hold the weight of memory. She repainted the dark green walls in soft blues and whites, letting natural light transform spaces that had felt like shrines to the past. 3 weeks after the cottage sale, James called unexpectedly. "Grandma, can I come see you? I'm driving down from school." When he arrived that evening, Margaret barely recognized him. Gone was the quiet, apologetic young man who'd stood in corners at family gatherings. This James carried himself differently. Straighter, more confident, as if her act of rebellion had somehow freed him too. "I have something for you," he said, pulling out a manila envelope. Inside were bank statements and legal documents. "Dad's financial situation is worse than anyone realized. The house in Wellesley is going into foreclosure. He's moved into a studio apartment downtown." Margaret studied the papers, feeling an unexpected pang of sympathy for her son. The numbers were even worse than Patricia had uncovered. David was completely broke, his law license under review, his marriage apparently over. "How did you get these?" "He asked me to help him organize his papers for the bankruptcy attorney." James sat down across from her. "Grandma, he's finally getting professional help. Not just financial. He's seeing a therapist too." "And the others?" "Mom's moved back with her sister in Connecticut." "Sarah." James paused. "Sarah's having a really hard time. Logan did leave her, just like she predicted. She's been staying with friends, but I think she's running out of options." Margaret felt the familiar tug of maternal instinct, the impulse to solve everyone's problems that had gotten her into this situation. But she pushed it down. "These are natural consequences of their choices, James. I know, and I'm not asking you to fix anything. I just thought you should know that the family explosion you triggered, It's forcing everyone to look at themselves honestly for the first time. Over the following months, Margaret's family members began to reach out to her individually, each in their own time and way. Sarah appeared at her door looking nothing like the polished young woman who had dismissed her grandmother's gift. Her designer clothes had been replaced by jeans and a simple sweater. Her perfectly styled hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her face was free of makeup. "Can I come in?" Sarah asked quietly. Margaret stepped aside, leading her granddaughter to the living room. Sarah looked around at the changes with surprise. The lighter furniture, the brighter walls, the sense of renewal that permeated the space. "I found them," Sarah said without preamble, reaching into her purse and carefully withdrawing the two knitted figures. "I didn't throw them away like I said. I put them in a box in my closet, and when I was packing up my apartment." Margaret watched as Sarah examined the bride doll with gentle fingers, her touch reverent now in a way it hadn't been before. Sarah's breath caught as she re-examined the small opening Margaret had created, understanding finally dawning. "I've been in therapy," Sarah continued, tears streaming down her face. "Dr. Martinez is helping me understand why I acted the way I did. Why I was so focused on appearances, on impressing people who didn't really matter." She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "She says I've been performing my whole life instead of actually living it. And what do you want to do now?" "I don't know yet, but I know I don't want to be the person who could hurt someone who loved me just to get a laugh." Sarah held out the ring Margaret had hidden. "This belongs to you." Margaret shook her head. "It was meant to be a wedding gift. Maybe someday, when you're ready to marry someone who values you for who you really are, you'll wear it." David appeared at her door 2 months later, and Margaret almost didn't recognize him. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by casual clothes that made him look younger somehow. The stressed lines around his eyes had deepened, but there was something clearer in his expression, something more honest. "I'm not here to ask for money or forgiveness," he said immediately. "I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did was wrong." Margaret invited him in, offering coffee that he accepted gratefully. "The bankruptcy is final," he said without preamble. "I lost the house, the practice, most of the things I thought defined me. But Dr. Kellerman, my therapist, says losing everything was the best thing that could have happened to me." "How so?" "Because it forced me to stop lying to myself about who I was and what I valued." David cradled his coffee mug, not meeting her eyes. "I convinced myself that providing financial security for the family justified any means necessary. But really, I was just scared of being seen as a failure." They talked for 2 hours. Really talked, perhaps for the first time since David was a child. He told her about his new job at a legal aid clinic, work that paid little but gave him genuine satisfaction. He described his therapy sessions, his gradual understanding of how his desperation had damaged everyone around him. 6 months after the cottage sale, Margaret hosted a small dinner party in her renovated home. The guest list was carefully chosen: James and his girlfriend Emma, Sarah, David, and Dr. Martinez, whom Sarah had asked to bring as her guest. Victoria had been invited but politely declined, still too ashamed to face Margaret directly. The conversation flowed more easily than Margaret had expected. Sarah talked about her new job at a nonprofit arts organization, work that paid little but gave her genuine satisfaction. David shared stories from the legal clinic, his eyes lighting up as he described helping elderly clients protect their assets from predatory family members. A irony that wasn't lost on anyone. "I have something for you," Sarah said after dinner, pulling out a small wrapped package. Inside was a knitted scarf in soft blues and grays, the stitches careful but imperfect. "I'm taking a handicrafts class," Sarah explained, blushing. "I wanted to understand what goes into making something by hand. It's harder than it looks." Margaret wrapped the scarf around her shoulders, feeling the love woven into every stitch. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." A year later, Margaret received a call from Jennifer Walsh, the real estate agent who had handled the cottage sale. "Mrs. Patterson, I have an interesting call for you. The couple who bought your cottage would like to meet you." Margaret was curious enough to agree. The new owners were a couple in their 40s who had fallen in love with the cottage's character. They invited Margaret for lunch, eager to share what they'd done with the property. To Margaret's surprise, they had restored rather than renovated, honoring the cottage's original charm while updating it thoughtfully. The kitchen still felt like her kitchen, just brighter and more functional. The living room where she and Paul had spent countless evenings remained warm and welcoming. "We found some things the previous owners left behind," the new owner said, leading Margaret to a closet. "We thought you might want them back." Inside were boxes of Paul's books, photo albums, and other personal items that Margaret had assumed were lost forever. Her hands trembled as she opened a box containing their wedding album, Paul's reading glasses, and the groom doll from Sarah's birthday party. "It was in the garage," the new owner explained gently. "We thought it might have sentimental value." Margaret accepted the doll with tears in her eyes. Somehow, having it back felt like reclaiming a piece of herself she'd thought was lost forever. Driving home that evening, Margaret reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. She had sold the cottage to make a statement about her worth and autonomy. In doing so, she had lost a family home but gained something more valuable: self-respect and the possibility of authentic relationships with the people she loved. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dad told me about your cottage visit. Are you okay?" Margaret smiled as she typed back, "Better than okay. I'm home." The cottage belonged to someone else now, but Margaret had finally found her way back to herself. The diamond ring sat in her jewelry box, waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right love. And for the first time in years, Margaret Patterson was the author of her own story, the protagonist of her own life. It wasn't the ending she'd expected when she'd carefully hidden that diamond in a knitted doll. It was better. It was true. It was hers.